start. Hello, I am Bryony. I am the Pledge for Nature coordinator at the North Devon Biosphere. So a few bits of housekeeping to start with. If everyone can make sure they're on mute, you should be already. And if you want to ask any questions, you should be able to do that by going on participants and asking in the chat function. You can put it on speaker view so you can see who's speaking. We've got some great people on our panel today. So we've got Rob from Devon Hedge Group, got Lisa from Devon Wildlife Trust and Sabine from FWAG. So yeah, we'll have a chance for questions at the end. But Rob is going to kick us off with a about 15-20 minute presentation on hedges, how we can manage them, and what we can do for wildlife in the hedges as well. So Rob, if you wanted to start.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Very shortly, I'm going to turn off my video because my broadband here isn't really very good. And it's better that you should be able to hear me probably rather than see me. So excuse me, I'll do that now actually. I'm going to turn off my video, but you should still be able to hear me. Right. Well, thank you all very much for joining in this evening. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes about hedge cutting, and then after Lisa and Sabine say a few words, there'll be plenty of time for questions after that, and I'm looking forward to hearing those. So during my 20 minutes, what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, why cutting hedges is a good idea, then about the different bits of machinery that can be used to cut hedges, then tackle the thorny question of how often to cut hedges. I'm going to touch upon the costs involved and also about hedgerow trees. And that should bring me to the end of my presentation. So if I can have the first slide, please. Thank you, Bryony. I should have said, everybody, that Bryony is changing slides for me, again, because of my slow broadband. If I was to do so, you would be waiting a long time in between each slide, which wouldn't be very good. But cutting hedges, and I'm sorry, you probably all absolutely know this already, but just to say that it is a good idea to cut hedges. And various reasons around that. First of all, it's necessary often alongside our roads and our lanes to stop them getting overgrown so we can get up and down them. If you're a farmer, obviously you don't want to let the hedges grow out into fields indefinitely because then you lose a lot of cropping area. Stock proofness, cut hedges tend to stay thick and bushy, but it has to be said that over half our hedges now have wire fences alongside them. So that aspect is no longer as important as it was. Then for wildlife, it's good. I'm going to come on to that in my next slide. And also, it's good from a cost perspective in terms of delaying the need for laying or coppicing. All hedges, sooner or later, will need rejuvenation, as we say, by laying or coppicing. However, they do become gappy eventually. But a good Devon hedge, if it's managed appropriately, including the right sort of cutting, should last 40, 50, 60 years before you need actually to lay or coppice it. And you don't really want to lay or coppice more often than you have to, because it's a very expensive and time-consuming business. So those are the reasons why cutting hedges is often a good idea. Next slide, please. Just to touch then about wildlife. So, if I'm put on the spot and asked, what's the best sort of hedge for wildlife? I will definitely say one that is thick and dense, the sort of hedge that is created by regular cutting. That's the sort of hedge you'll get nests like, breeding birds. There's a chaffinch nest we see here. And also the sort of hedge that is favoured by hazel dormice. Now, dormice, they're a Devon special species because in this county, we still are fortunate in having a lot of them, but yet they're declining nationally. They're special Devon special species because we have a particular responsibility at a UK level for their survival. Now, dormice spend nearly their whole lives asleep. You know, they're not sleeping, they're torpid, and they're not torpid, they're hibernating. And that means they have to have really safe, secure nesting places. And you can only get those in thick, dense hedges. By the time your hedge has turned into a line of trees or, you know, much taller, then it becomes very gappy, the wind whistles through it. And the only thing you tend to get breeding in those hedges are wood pigeons, magpies, crows, one or two other big birds. So generally, thick, short hedges created by cutting are good for wildlife. Next slide, please. So the other thing I would say about a really good hedge is that it should have occasional standard trees scattered along its length. The research shows that that really does boost the amount of wildlife in a farm landscape for a variety of different reasons. Hedgerow trees, and I'll touch upon them a bit later on in this presentation, really do attract the wildlife. And they're also, of course, scenically attractive. And in these days, when we're all talking about climate change and what we can do to mitigate it, then they are very good stores of carbon. You know, a hedgerow tree stores, you know, probably 100 times as much carbon as your average bush in a well-cut hedge. So important from that point of view. So now I'm going to come on to how to cut hedges, the different machinery. Bryony, please. Thank you. Now here we have a splendid example of how they do it in Ireland. And I seem to be working very well, doesn't it? But not common in these parts. Instead, in the next slide, please, we use nearly always the flail cutter. Now, this is, from my point of view, and I should have said right at the beginning, we've got a farm here near Hatherley. And I've been managing the hedges here for 30 or so years. So we cut them with flails, or rather I ask our neighbouring farmer who's a contractor to do that. And so every year I have a proportion of our hedges on the farm cut. It's a quick, it's efficient, and above all, it doesn't leave any mess behind that you have to clear up by hand or with another piece of machinery. Next slide, please. Then the alternative probably is to use these rotary saw attachments. So again, this is an implement you attach to the tractor. You can see it there, you know, whirling blades going round. They use it a lot across the channel for cutting the hedges here, but they've never really caught on in this country. They're very good for cutting larger material cleanly. I mean, material up to 10, 12 inches in size can be sliced through by this. But what you're left with is a whole jumble of branches and stems lying on the ground. Then those have to be picked up, typically pushed into a heap with a front loader and probably burnt, which adds to the cost and time involved in the operation considerably. But on the other hand, if you do thinking about reshaping a overgrown hedge, or perhaps you want to cut it right to the ground by coppicing it, then these are implements you should consider. Next slide, please. So that's the machinery dealt with. Now, as I say, the difficult, and this is the most contentious area about hedge cutting, is the frequency of hedge cutting, how often to do it. Now, the first point I'd make here is, and I'm sure most of you already know this, so forgive me for repeating it, but most of our trees and shrubs only produce flowers on last year's growth. That does mean if you cut a hedge hard back every year, it won't produce any flowers. And if there are no flowers, then there are no berries and no nuts. So hard cutting back every year is not a really good idea from a wildlife point of view. We see Sorry, I just need to turn something off. We see in countryside stewardship scheme that farmers are encouraged to cut their hedges either on a 2 or 3 year rotation. Now, cutting on a 2 year rotation is all right, but only if you can cut in the late winter, which is virtually impossible anywhere in northern Devon because our soils just won't support the machinery any time after October. I mean, I was caught out last year because wanted our hedges cut in October, but by then it was too late, and apart from alongside the lanes, our contractor just couldn't get on the ground. But if you cut in the autumn, then you're removing all the berries, and in fact there's very little advantage. On the other hand though, if you can cut on a 3 year rotation, then there really are advantages in that in terms of the flowers and berries. So that is a really good idea. Next slide, please. Just one species that really exemplifies the benefits of not cutting every year is the brown hair streak butterfly. Now, this is quite an elusive species. It's quite difficult to see. It flies late in the summer, early in the autumn. But we're fortunate. We've still got quite a lot of these over northern Devon, over the Culm, whereas over most of the country, they're now rare or disappeared. It's another of these Devon special species, one for which we have a UK responsibility. Now, the butterfly lays its eggs only on the new growth of blackthorn. And it needs blackthorn in open sunny positions, and so really likes hedges. And obviously then if you cut your hedges hard every year, all the eggs will be destroyed and the butterfly will disappear. And that's believed to be the main reason why it has declined over most of the country. Next slide, please. So, sorry, bear with me a moment. There are various reasons why farmers don't like cutting hedges on a 3 year rotation, and I understand these reasons entirely. And there's 3 main ones, I think. And I think I'm going to go through them now. First of all, there is concern that the machinery, the flail cutters, will not cope very well, particularly with 3 or 4 year old willow, sycamore, or ash. Our contractor and other contractors I'm speaking to say this isn't a problem because you'll normally have heavy duty machinery which can bash through it fine. And provided the flails are kept sharp and provided the forward speed of the tractor is adjusted appropriately, there's no damage done. But I do accept that for farmers with lightweight machines cutting their own hedges perhaps, and this may be a problem. The second reason that farmers don't like this is because of the belief that it makes the hedges gappier at the base faster. But DEFRA specifically commissioned the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to carry out research on this. And their research clearly showed that in fact it does not hasten the rate at which gaps form in a hedge. And then next slide, please. The third reason is, in fact, that if you cut on a 3 year rotation, it leaves one hell of a mess. It's very untidy. And also that will introduce, diseases and rots, and you'll get mortality of the trees and shrubs. However, in my experience and others, in fact, even as we see in the slide here, this is a willow hedge that was cut with 3 or 4 years growth on it. Even damage like that recovers remarkably rapidly. And by July the following year, you've probably never known that had been done. And the reason for this may well be, bizarrely, due to the presence, because our trees and shrubs are adapted to being browsed by straight-tusked elephants, which apparently used to roam the countryside before the last ice age. And you know how elephants eat things, that they rip and tear and shred rather than bite them off neatly. Whatever the reason though, our native trees and shrubs in our hedges are remarkably resilient to this sort of damage. So just to conclude a little bit on hedge cutting, next slide please. A lovely cartoon here drawn by Heather Harley of the Devon Hedge Group. And this just sort of summarizes a little bit. If you want lots of birds and dormice and things in your hedge and you want to be happy, don't cut it back hard every year. Next slide, please. But I do accept, that for many farmers, cutting on a 3-year rotation, just for the reasons I've given, one or other of those reasons, or perhaps other reasons, isn't an attractive option. But fortunately, there is an alternative, and it's a real alternative, and that's what we call incremental growth trimming or incremental trimming. And this is where each time you cut, you don't cut hard back to the original cut line, but you allow the hedge to grow out just a few inches each time. 4 to 6 inches is fine. And the research here shows that this does deliver significant benefits in terms of flowers and berries over cutting hedges back hard. The drawback is that it's not currently supported by countryside stewardship, but hopefully in the scheme that succeeds countryside stewardship, in this Brexit era, that incremental growth trimming will be supported by that scheme. Next slide, please. We can see here a hedge, in fact, it's a hedge that's cut every year, but it is allowed to just expand this little way, and it's absolutely full of berries, so it can produce wonderful results. Right, I'm coming on to costs now. Next slide. It's difficult to get accurate costs of hedge trimming with flails. Because every farm is different and contractor costs tend to be wrapped up in other things. But the Devon Hedge Group has done some research on this. We got accurate figures from a number of commercial farmers. And although it varies a good deal, typically it costs about 30 pence per metre. And that's with 7 passes of the flail and based on a contractor cost of £30 per hour. Now that's quite a lot of money, and in fact, most commercial farms where the hedges are cut regularly will be spending hundreds, if not thousands of pounds every year cutting their hedges. So that if it can be done cheaper, there are substantial savings to be had. And indeed, if you cut a hedge every 3 years, that even though the hedge is bigger and it takes more time, in fact, overall, year on year, hedge cutting costs are halved down to about 16 pence per metre. So, if you have a countryside stewardship agreement, not only are you getting paid not to cut your hedges every year, but you're actually saving money as well. So it's a real win-win. I talked about annual growth, annual incremental trimming. Unfortunately, there are no savings there because you're still cutting every year. And also the other point I'd make is that if you have hedgerow trees, and I'm coming on to hedgerow trees, then they do increase the costs of cutting because you have to maneuver the machinery around them, and that takes time. Next slide. So, hedgerow trees, just a couple of slides here about hedgerow trees. As I said, really important for wildlife. And in these days, particularly of ash dieback, when we're losing so many trees, can I please urge everybody to encourage new trees to grow? I mean, it's often not necessary to plant because there is plenty of material, stems, saplings, shoots already in our hedges that if only they're given a chance will turn into perfectly decent hedgerow trees in the future. But they do need to be marked. Our contractor, for example, because his farm is next door and he just fits us in around other jobs, sometimes cuts our hedges at night by the aid of his tractor headlights. And if our young trees are not marked clearly, they're going to be at risk. but he's very good, and I haven't lost any yet. And what we should aim probably to do is have on average, and this isn't regular even spacing, but on average, one mature tree for every 40 meters. To get that though, you have to allow for some death mortality to occur in the younger trees. So starting off with about one every 20 meters is probably a good idea. Next slide. I would urge you please to think not just terms of big trees like beech and oak, but in terms of smaller ones too, like hawthorn or rowan. I mean, one mature hawthorn bush that's allowed to flower and produce lots of berries can produce as many flowers and berries as 200 meters of regularly cut hedgerow. So, enormous benefits to be had there. Think small as well as big. And next slide. That was just covering trees quickly. Just to make the point though, as I touched on in the beginning, however careful you are about cutting your hedges, you can't keep a hedge in good, healthy condition forever without rejuvenating it periodically by coppicing or laying. A hedge will inevitably start to become gappy at the base or along its length. And when that happens, it needs to be allowed to grow up and then to be laid or coppiced and start the whole hedge management cycle over again. But you should, with careful trimming, best practice, get 40 to 60 years out of a species-rich Devon hedge. Next slide, please. But, inevitably, and it's happened on our farm, things go wrong from time to time, a series of bad years when you can't cut or something. And we see examples, as you see in this slide. So the top photograph, and I'm sure you've all seen hedges like this, is where a hedge has been cut incessantly, year after year, at exactly the same height, cut hard. And it has, inevitably developed this gappy form. Now, to restore that hedge, and we're talking about restoration here rather than rejuvenation, is quite an expensive thing to do. And again, the other end of the cycle, the bottom photograph shows a hedge that has turned into a line of trees. And here, the bank has disappeared altogether. The bank, as you know, is at the heart of a Devon hedge. But due to increased erosion, which happens when you get lines of trees, bank's gone. And to restore that hedge is a really expensive business because you've got to rebuild the bank. Right. Next slide, please. Pledge for nature. I'm sure Brian will tell us a little bit more about this as well. But basically, Pledge for Nature. And ironically, wasn't it, last night I heard Boris Johnson talking about Pledge for Nature. Apparently it's now an international thing, and we're doing it on a grand scale. But we started it first here in North Devon. And we set up about, I don't know, what was it, a year ago, and probably less than that. I got COVID brain, can't remember timescales very well. But we set up here in the Biosphere Reserve in Northern Devon, this Pledge for Nature thing, which is all about people living locally being able to demonstrate their support for nature by doing good things by it. And this particular quarter, I think it's October, November, December, we're really encouraging people, please, to give a hedge a few inches. So to just not cut a hedge back as hard as you might have done at one time. So please, if you are not already doing so, if you can just set aside a small section of hedge, just 50 meters, for example, and not cut it hard, but just give it a few inches, then that's going to be really good for wildlife. And if you can do that, then make a pledge for nature by visiting the website or going onto the Facebook page or tweeting about it or emailing the Biosphere Reserve, just to demonstrate your support for nature and local community. It'd be great if you can do that, please. And now my final slide, I think, Rani, is just to summarize some of the key points I made here. So first of all, I'm all in favour of flail cutters. You know, lots of people say they're really bad, but in point of fact, I think they're an essential item for the good management of hedges, but need to be used sensitively. If you can, please do let your hedges grow a few inches. Don't cut hard back to the former line of cutting. And that's especially important if you're going to cut your hedges every year. Just allow the hedges to expand a little bit. If you can leave some hedges uncut for 3 or more years, then that's fantastic. But please do, and I haven't touched on this before, but please do manage your hedges on rotation. So if you are cutting on a 3-year rotation, then there's no point in cutting the whole farm in 1 year, because then, you know, species like, for example, the brown hair streak butterfly, well, it'll still go extinct locally. Establish that rotation. And the final point I made, just to reiterate, is please do encourage hedgerow trees. And I expect Sabine may be saying something about that, but vital, particularly in this time of ash dieback. So my very final slide is to say thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope you've been able to hear me clearly, and I shall look forward to hearing your questions in a moment or two. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Rob. Okay, so I think we'll probably go straight into Sabine, if that's okay. So Sabine is going to be talking about the Saving Devon Treescapes project.
Okay. Yes, I'm Sabine McEwan. I work for FWAG Southwest, which is the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. And I'm introducing a project called Saving Devon's Treescapes, which is actually run by Devon Wildlife Trust on behalf of the Devon Ash Dieback Resilience Forum. So it has a lot of partners pulled together to look after Devon's treescapes, but I'm just the representative today, basically. Could we move on to the next slide, please? I just wanted it to keep it really short and just give you an overview. So basically the whole idea for setting up this project was that, you know, this whole Devon landscape or treescapes, or however you want to call it, of, you know, having tightly cut hedges, having some hedges with individual trees, having some small pockets of woodland, but also having loads and loads of trees outside of woodlands. Basically, the idea is that it needs to be saved, especially right now, because there are so many different threats for those treescapes. One of them is that hedge trees or infield trees are quite often very old, and so they are nearing the end of their life naturally anyway. And then we also have ash dieback, and that is one of the most common hedgerow or outside of woodland tree at the moment. And about 90% are kind of predicted to die over the coming years or decades. So we really need to start now, or probably should have started a few years ago, to get more trees going, to make sure that, you know, future generations, if you like, still have those nice Devon treescapes to look at. So the project is doing all sorts of different things. I've just pulled out a few different things, different targets. So it's setting up 3 community nurseries to grow their own trees to then supply to schools and communities, deliver workshops, set up wood fuel hubs. Overall aim is to plant and nurture 250,000 trees all across Devon, and tag and nurture 12,000 hedgerow trees, like Rob has already said, and, you know, plant 4,500 wild fruit roots in urban landscapes. So it's not just stretching across, you know, the farmed landscape with the hedges, but looking at urban sites and across the whole of Devon. So the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group is working for that project to kind of deliver the farming rural aspects of the work, and that is basically offering free advisory visits to look into, you know, hedge management or management of infield trees, or wood pasture on farmland, and which hedge trees we could tag to allow them to grow up, what hedge restoration options or planting new hedges, where would that be suitable and how can that be funded. It's mainly through countryside stewardship funding rather than project funding, so it depends whether you're already in a scheme but basically we can cover on the visit whether there would be funding available or not. There's also a target of planting small on-farm woodlands, so they are not the sort of woodland creation large ones, but more the kind of really small localized nice pockets of woodlands. And generally, as we walk the farmland, it's kind of looking at a 3-2-1 ash replacement formula. So that's planting or allowing to grow 3 new trees for every large ash tree, whether that shows signs of dieback or not, 2 trees for every medium-sized ash tree, and 1 for every small-sized ash tree. And that could be either, planting new infield trees, or planting a hedge with standard trees, or allowing individual trees to grow up. So there's a whole range of options. So yeah, if anyone is interested in one of those visits, I think at the moment we only have about 10 left for this year. But after March next year, there will be a whole other year of visits available. So if you would like to contact me, and I can put you on the list and see whether we can squeeze you in this year or next year and see what we can do for you.
Great, thank you, Sabine. Okay, so finally, Lisa, would you like to kind of introduce Devon Wildlife Trust and the work you do?
Thank you, Bryony. Couple of excellent presentations there, thank you very much. And I do want to just add to those with a little bit of extra information from Devon Wildlife Trust. So I am the Nature Improvement Area Manager. It's a very grand title, but it effectively means that I'm the manager of the advisory teams that Devon Wildlife Trust has working in North Devon on the Torridge and the Tor catchments at the moment. We have 2 current projects. One is working on culm grassland and the flood risk benefits of that. And the other project is working on key areas of the River Torridge to help landowners restore parts of the river and the water quality and various other aspects of the river they're in. So we have our advisors who are available to come out on farm. They are not hedge specific advisors, but inevitably, as part of the advice that those advisors give, they will be able to give some guidance on hedge management as part of our overall advice. You may well expect Devon Wildlife Trust to give advice that benefits wildlife. It's kind of in the name of it, isn't it? But I also did want to just add to what both Rob and Sabine have said about the value of Devon's hedgerows. If there were ever any intervention that a farmer or landowner could make on their land, which is cost effective, it often saves money, as Rob has said, but it is very effective with respect to wildlife and the environment more generally. It is really trying to tweak the management of hedges to improve their condition. And that is very good for wildlife. If you imagine that Devon does have more hedges than any other county in England. And for wildlife, they're a little bit like a strip of linear woodland. So if you imagine how all the hedges across the landscape might be, if all of them were more bursting with wildlife than they are at the minute, that is a fantastic thing. But those hedges can also have a lot of other benefits, ranging from helping us to manage flooding, helping us to store carbon, as Rob has said, helping to manage water quality, lots and lots of other benefits that those hedges can bring. And no matter what your farming operation might be, no matter how intensive your farming operation might be, the vast majority, if not all, of Devon landowners, certainly in the lowlands, have got hedges. So I really, really would encourage you to have a go. The results are incredibly pleasing and very, very inspiring. If there's anything we can do to help you with that, we certainly will. And please do take advantage of some of that advice available. Our projects on landowner advice, as I was talking to Sabine about earlier, are The current projects are coming to an end within the next 6 months to a year, and we are very busy fundraising at the moment to try to make sure that we can continue to support the landowners in North Devon in carrying on making our environment even better. I have to say North Devon is a world-class environment as it is, but yeah, all the group effort, there is so much inspiring work going on. So yeah, give it a go. That's all I'll say.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to